dear professor, could you please introduce yourself and tell your story, how you began your way in the martial arts?
My father, when I was growing up, was studying with different people who were bringing karate to the East Coast in the New Jersey, New York area. So this is back in the 60s when everything was first beginning. There was a guy named Harold Royman who did style of karate, and then there was Peter Urban and a few other people. So kind of grew up into it. My father kind of introduced me. He says around the age of 4, but it's kind of young. So, but I grew up in it. So definitely influenced by my father, who was very open-minded. And as I grew older, he was a big influence on how I thought about the arts and where I was going in what direction. So that's how it started. I mean, I was a very little baby,
So this is your first martial arts, yeah? You should start.
My first martial art?
Yeah.
Well, he was just introducing me to basic karate, blocking and stuff like that. I mean, his philosophy was that as a young kid, he didn't want me to learn how to hit too much, but he definitely wanted me to learn how to block and be able to defend myself. So that was the primary beginning, and then sparring, a lot of sparring, but basic fundamental karate was where I started out as a young kid. So that was pretty much that.
What is Ju-Jutsu? How you could describe this as kind of martial arts?
It's an interesting term. Ju-Jutsu is a very old art that dates back, of course, to Japan, 18th century, that we know of, documented, in various schools existed prior to the creation of what we now know as judo, right? Judo itself coming from 2 different forms of jiu-jitsu that Professor Kano had learned. And the jiu-jitsu that we know in Japan, a lot of it is formalized through kata, or what the karate people would call bunkai, application, right? One person doing the set thing and the other person having a response. So it's more of a call and response system. And even in some of the more modernized versions of aikijitsu, you're going to see the same thing. It's pretty much, attacker grabs wrist and then a response. Attacker grabs wrist and punches, and then there's a response. Generally speaking, I really haven't seen too many traditional, I'm talking traditional, Japanese jiu-jitsu systems that have randori, or kumite, as you would call it in karate, right? Randori and judo. Tomiki Aikido being the exception. When Grandmaster Tomiki was creating his take on Tomiki Aikido, or what they called later on Tomiki Aikido, he was already highly ranked in judo, so he incorporated the randori concepts into his Aikido. So in his system, you would see resistance and sparring, but generally you don't see that in traditional jiu-jitsu. It's not about what we see today. I mean, today, because of BJJ and MMA, we see a lot of, what they call mixed martial arts, which, is probably not the right term to call it anyway. But you see a lot of that combination of, Muay Thai and Western boxing and grappling and so forth. But that's not traditional. That's a modernized version of jiu-jitsu, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. How would you describe the philosophy of jiu-jitsu? What's the main principles?
I guess it depends on who you're going to ask. If you're looking at American combatives type of jiu-jitsu, what you would see as sort of gutter fighting, like what they taught in World War II, or even in other countries before it became more of a sport, it was survival of the fittest, right? I mean, everything you did was jiu-jitsu. You hit him with a chair, it was jiu-jitsu. You hit him with something else, a rock, it was jiu-jitsu, it was self-defense, right? Before it became art, was self-defense by any means necessary against a person armed or unarmed. So there really was no philosophy necessarily, unless you want to consider survival of the fittest as a philosophy, Later, with the split historically between what they call the do, the version, the idea of do, like Ju-Jutsu versus Judo, Yaido versus Kendo. If something becomes a do or a way, there's more of a philosophic aspect to it historically, right? Because after the last great battles in Japan, there was no need anymore, really, for the violent aspects of the warfare tactics that you would see done in jiu-jitsu in the battlefield. Grappling with somebody and pulling up their helmet and taking out your tanto and then stabbing them, for example, right? It became more of a self-expression or a philosophy of discipline, right? How to discipline your mind and discipline your spirit and become a better person, right? That's the idea of the Do methods by and large. But that's not necessarily self-defense. That becomes more art, right? So it depends if you're asking me from a developmental side or from a self-defense side, because they're two different things.
Both, in the mental and in the self-defense.
Well, it's funny because I think a lot about this, and self-defense is very primitive, right? There's only going to be a handful of things that are really going to so-called work in reality. So there's no so-called style. There's a system, and then that your style is an expression of that system, how you do it, how you implement that, right? So you and I might study the same system, but your style, your sense of self-expression might be different. Different likes, different dislikes, different physical attributes, capabilities, and so on. You may like a particular way of doing something that I might not feel comfortable with, but that doesn't invalidate what you do because you're a unique individual, separate from anyone else. Only one of you. So you may do something that works for you, but maybe it's unorthodox, right? But it works. So efficiency and pragmatism ultimately is what's going to extricate yourself from a tenuous situation, right? But by and large, a lot of times what people don't talk about is the survival, the mental aspect of just survival. You can learn all the things in the world you want technically, but if you don't have it in you, the gumption, the willingness, the ability to really survive, then it doesn't really matter what you know, because you're going to perish anyhow. So I think the hardest thing to train on people is the ability to face confrontation and face it successfully, right? I mean, there's three types of responses you can have, right? And the third one, most people don't talk about. You have fight, you have flight. Everybody talks about the fight or flight response, right? But the third one is freeze, right? And most people don't talk about freeze. But by and large, statistically, a lot of people have been known to freeze. They're not doing either fight or flight. They just, like I said, they just freeze, right? They just get at that deer in the headlights thing. So how do you know what a person's going to do in reality when confronted with a despicable situation? You don't know. So all the training in the world is fun, and it's a good hobby and wonderful pastime, but it's not reality, right? I mean, how do we define reality? How can you train for reality? You really can't. People say, oh, we got a gun defense, I got a knife defense, I've got a club defense. Well, it's academic. It might work in the dojo because you have a cooperative partner, but the streets, that's not the dojo, and that person's going to be fighting you back. He's not just going to let you do what you're going to do. I mean, he attacks, he's not just going to stand there. It's what I call the myth of the one-armed attacker, right? He's just going to stand there and let you do what you're going to do. Action begets reaction. So whatever you do, he's going to be fighting you back. So if you're going for a gun disarm, he's not going to let you, disarm him. He's going to be fighting you back. Same thing with the knife, right? He's going to be fighting you back. So whatever you train in, if you're talking about realism, realistic premise, you always have to consider that the person going to be fighting you back, right? It's not just going to be where he's going to cooperate, and it's very pretty and very beautiful. You know, like a Steven Seagal movie with the ponytail, right? He does something and the guy looks really pretty doing it. But that's not reality. That's Hollywood, right? That's the movies,
Yeah.
you know. So there's a big difference between the two. So the mental aspects, that's the hard part to train. The physical stuff, you know, most people can get, give or take, you know.
Is it possible to use philosophy of Jiu-Jitsu in usual life, in business?
Of course. I mean, if you are not, of course. I mean, think about it. You know, if you're used to being pressured, I mean, let's say you're doing sparring, right? Jiu-Jitsu sense, and the guy's trying to rip your arm off. I mean, he's really determined that he wants to take your arm. And you're fighting him back and you're stopping him, you're resisting, you're getting out of it, you're figuring out, and you're not giving up, right? You're like, I'm not going to allow him to do that, right? Well, of course, that can translate into real life because that's a business tactic, isn't it? You know, you're trying to see if you can get your way and not let the opponent or the other business person have their way, whether it's negotiations for purchasing something, negotiations for, you know, a firm with, say, personnel and hiring. All these things are applicable. So, of course, it's going to apply in real life. I mean, just the sheer willingness not to give up is a big plus in the world, isn't it? Because you're not, and also, it's if people work on the idea of intimidation, top dog, underdog, right? Type A dog or alpha male stuff. If you have the willingness to be that alpha male in the room and know that if the other alpha male is going to be alpha male and you can hold your own, then there's a certain amount of confidence and a certain amount of fearlessness that you have in that negotiation process, isn't there? So, of course, it's going to apply, you know, of course.
Is it possible to practice Jiu-Jitsu alone at home, maybe?
It's funny you asked me that. I had a fencing teacher when I was very young, very famous Hungarian saber coach. And I asked him once, you know, can you learn fencing from a book? That was my question. I asked him in Hungarian because I was able to speak the language. And he said in Hungarian, "Sehogy," which means in English, like, there's no way you can do it. There's not an adequate translation of that word into English, right? But it's no can't do. You just can't do it. So jiu-jitsu is not like in karate, for example, traditional karate, especially like from Okinawa, you have kata, right? And you can practice your, you know, atewaza, your temiwaza on a makiwara, or you have traditional implements that you can use to train your body, right? That look like weights, or, you know, clay jars you can wrap your fingers around and do your practice and your stepping and so on, like what you see in Weijitsu or in traditional Goju-ryu, right? You can do that. You can train your body, right? But in jiu-jitsu, it's a different thing because by and large, you need someone to give you feedback on what you're doing, right? It's the same with judo. It's the same with sambo. You need somebody who's going to give you resistance to what you're doing, or if not resistance, at least feedback that you're doing something, right? Either correct or incorrect. So I think it's almost impossible. I mean, maybe somebody out there has, you know, a solution, but I think it's one of those arts that you really do need a person to train with.
Who do you consider the best master-patriarchs of the Jiu-Jitsu?
There's no way I can answer that. I mean, that's impossible. I mean, do you mean from a sport sense, from a modern historical sense as in ancient times? I mean, what, you gotta narrow that question down.
Ancient time, who is a patriarchy, who is creating the main flow and the main philosophy of this martial arts? On your opinion, of course.
I mean, historically, the only person we can speak of that was pivotal, probably the single most important figure in Japanese martial arts is Kano Jigoro Kano, the founder of judo, right? Because he was a Jiu-Jitsu practitioner before he created and synthesized those two systems that he learned into what we now call judo, right? And also he was pivotal in having that art become an Olympic sport. So, and one of his famous students put his system of judo on the map by using a very famous throw. I think it was Yamarashi mountain throw against another opponent from a rival jiu-jitsu school to make judo famous, right? And put it on the map. But the institute, the Kodokan Institute, was world famous because they had so many different people practicing so many different things. I mean, Kano was a genius. He would send off his top students to train in different martial arts, like Minoru Mochizuki, for example, trained with Morihei Ueshiba, O-sensei of Aikido. Kenji Tomiki also did that. Many of the judo practitioners at that time ended up transitioning into Aikido, right? Like Coach Koichi Tohei sensei was a judo practitioner before he did Aikido. One of my Aikido teachers, Seiichi Sugano, was also third dan in judo before he did Aikido. So judo is a pivotal art. To me, if you're studying traditional Japanese martial arts, judo should be a foundation art that you study, especially when you're young, because it gives you so many good tools. I mean, excellent tools to develop. You know, then from there, you can also do other things too, to fill in the gaps of what judo might lack in terms of atemi and self-defense against weapons and so on. But even Bruce Lee said that judo is one of the most superior and pragmatic arts that was ever on the planet. Even he respected it greatly because he knew the value of judo. So in my opinion, if you're talking about that transitional period, I would have to say Jigoro Kano without a question, you know.
Thank you. About your practicing, about your training, are you using some methodology? If yes, which one?
The Kihon and the basics are based on just basic Tai Sabaki or Taijutsu, you know, stepping principles. You know, you're on the inside, you're on the outside. You're facing left or you're facing right. That's it. It's really that simple. There's no other way. I mean, there's, you know, you can multiply that, you know, permutation and combinations 1,000 different ways. It's like when people say, you know, we have 10,000 techniques in our system. No, you don't. You have maybe, you know, 6 or 7, 12, maybe core techniques, and the rest are extractions or variations of that technique, right? So even in Aikido, you see that they, we have 10,000 techniques. No, you don't. You have a handful of techniques, right? And variations of that, you know. Same thing in judo, right? They went from 40 basic throws, and I don't even know how many now there are in the Kodokan. I think it's more than 40. It used to be 40, right? The Gokin no Waza were 40 basic techniques. You know, there were hand techniques, leg techniques, and hip techniques, right? Leg techniques, Ashi Waza, Te Waza, Koshi Waza. So keep it simple, right? I mean, it's more about principles than it is technique, isn't it? Because principles will save your life and technique might get you confused, right?
How do you usually fight with students mentally? I mean, understanding real sparring and real combat. This is a difference on training. How you separate this is understanding of your students.
Well, you know, this that term that people use all the time called pressure testing, right? I don't believe that you need to be abusive, right? Because some teachers are borderline abusive, like they're almost like a psychopath in terms of how much abuse they put on a student, you know, slapping them or physically roughing them up. You know, there's one guy on the internet now, he's all over the place. He's really abusive with students. I don't see a need for that, you know. Take somebody to a position that's uncomfortable where they're going to be pressure tested and let them figure it out, you know, and see how well they respond. I'll give you an example. If you take somebody past a point of normal fatigue in sparring, right? where they're really gassed out and they don't have anything left, pressure them to continue to see how well they do, even when they're tired, right? And you could have a certain mental and physical breakthrough with that person if they are willing to do it. And you don't have to be abusive in that, just put the pressure on them to let them perform. I'll give you an example by way of a story. I had I was teaching Escrima, Filipino stick fighting, knife fighting. I had a female student who came in one day and she was going through a lot of stuff, which I knew because she had told me her personal history. And she came into class late and she said, oh, Sensei, I don't, I really don't want to spar today. I'm not feeling it. I'm like, I don't want to do any sparring at all. I just want to come to class and do my thing and go. I said, really? Okay. So I put her on the floor and I told her, I said, now you have to survive. Not only do you have to spar one person, you have to spar 3 people, all back to back. And you're going to stop when I tell you to stop. And I'm going to stand behind you with Shinai. And if you go backwards too much and you retreat, I'm going to smack you on the behind a little bit just to let you know you can't go backwards. The only direction you can go is forward or side to side or circular, but you're not going to retreat. Not allowed. No retreat. Give no quarter, And she was just really beside herself. Because she clearly said to me when she came in that there's no way she wanted to do any kind of sparring, right? It was like out of the question for her. But I knew that she's going through a crazy divorce with a husband who was supported by the church and she was the bad guy. I knew that everybody was against her and she was feeling like a fish out of water. And because I know of her personal background, and I knew that part of her reason for not fighting was she was in a place of fear, a place of being attacked from all different sides about, even her kids were like, Mom, you can't get a divorce from Dad. Dad was like one of those cool guys. He was like the bass player in the band in the church, and one of those kind of guys, drove a truck, just a really popular guy. So, and even the church pastor told her that, divorce is against the doctrines of the church. I told her that's nonsense. Follow your heart. What are you doing? I'm not the pastor. I can tell you whatever I want. But I was one of the only people she could confide in, right? So I said, no way you're going to retreat. Get on that floor. If you want to survive, you have to learn how to survive. Get on the floor, do your best. And she did. Oh, she was crying. She was upset. But I'm going to tell you something. The breakthrough that she had emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually by combating her fears of not giving up in that moment in the sparring, despite the fact she did not want to do it, knowing that she was able to overcome even though she did not want to do it, was an incredible breakthrough for her. She credited me with that session for being allowed to tell her husband a healthy no. I'm out of the situation. She got a divorce. She went and married some other guy. She traveled around the world. She's very, very happy now because she's able to get out of that situation. But that's one of my proudest moments because it was a pivotal moment for her to develop a healthy no. You got to realize something in real life. In order for you to engage life, sometimes you have to have a healthy no before you can have a healthy yes. You understand? And that's part of what martial arts can teach you, how to have a healthy no, to embrace what's on the other side, right?
Mm-hmm. Do you recommend some books for your students to reading about martial arts?
Most of the books I see today are based on sport or some strange form of self-defense. So I don't like most of what I see today, honestly. I think a lot of it's a waste of money. If you're going to read something to help you gain a sense of priority in terms of being a martial artist, you can read books on philosophy, like, you know, Miyamoto Musashi's Book of Five Rings, or you can read Mao Zedong's book on guerrilla warfare, Che Guevara's book on guerrilla warfare, right? You can read Sun Tzu's Art of War, for example. To me, these are the best martial art books you can possibly look at, because it's not going to teach you, you know, how to block and how to hit, but it develops you mentally and develops you in terms of the philosophy of what to do in real life. Like even if you just understood the concept from Sun Tzu's Art of War about know the ground, that goes back to your business question earlier. If you know the ground, if you understand the rules, if you understand the rules of engagement, right, you got most of the battle already won, because you're fighting on your terms, right? So most of what I see in terms of technique, I think, are a waste of time, you know. But in terms of the mental philosophical aspects, I think these kind of books are better. Anything on guerrilla warfare, I recommend, because that's what martial arts is, isn't it? I mean, it's guerrilla warfare. You know, you attack from the side, you attack from the rear, you attack from the most vulnerable point that the enemy's in, right? Know when to allow the enemy to retreat, right? Psychologically, okay, to give them an out, so you don't have to be as bloody as you need to be. Even in Tai Chi, you know, when the Yang family is talking about the Tai Chi songs, you know, it clearly says, you know, attack the vulnerable, soft side of the opponent, never meet the opponent head on, right? So this kind of philosophy is endemic in guerrilla warfare, isn't it? So I think if people study all the great guerrilla warfare tacticians, or even okay, why am I drawing a blank on his name? Lawrence of Arabia, the 7 pillars or 11 pillars, I think it's 7 pillars, I think of it's called, of his philosophy on guerrilla warfare and fighting. I mean, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe Lawrence of Arabia, right? Are you going to believe Mao Zedong, right? Or people who wrote Sun Tzu, or are you going to believe some crazy sensei who's eating too much sweet cereal? I mean, who are you going to believe, right? No, my money's on those guys.